So my name is Joan Borrell, and I'm with the team with Professor Pedro Azara and Marc and Eric Rusin from the University UPC in Barcelona in the School of Architecture. And we're doing this read, which is what does an architect among archaeologists really do? The present paper has been prepared and it is being presented by Spanish architects and students of architecture from the School of Architecture in Barcelona, Spain, who are participating in archaeological missions since 2007. The French archaeologist Dr. Maria Grazia Masset-Rouault, Sorbonne University, Paris, asked us to work on her international mission in Tel Masaikh, Syria, until 2010, and since then in her international mission at Qasr Shamamok, near Erbil in the Iraqi Kurdistan. At the same time, the Spanish Egyptologist Dr. Emma González, Universidad Autónoma from Barcelona, has invited us this year to work at her Spanish archaeological mission in Abydos, in Egypt. We would like to think about what architects could bring to archaeology based on our experience in the 3 missions we have participated these last 8 years. To think if a new point of view, a new stand on an archaeological site can be brought from architecture. We would like to add that we're also going to show some images from 2007 on of our interpretation or proposal of how the excavated Neo-Assyrian structures at Tel Masaikh, Syria, and Qasr Shamamok, Iraq, could have been built and articulated in the 1st millennium BC. Architects are needed in certain archaeological missions where architectural remains stand well, visible on the ground, and need just to be restored. This happens, for instance, with our work in the Abydos archaeological mission. The Seti First Temple, or the Osiraion, are stone structures in good condition, built in a short period of time. Almost no excavation is needed, just consolidation and reintegration of fallen or missing stones. In that case, the work of an architect is not much different from the work of an architect who would have to rehabilitate the hotel in which we are seated now. But the type of collaboration between an archaeologist and an architect about which we're going to talk is different. We're going to talk about missions where no rehabilitation or restoration processes are requested or possible. In that case, what does an architect do in an archaeological mission? An archaeologist looks at the past. The past he or she studies belongs to human beings. These have left remains, man-made items, manufactured objects, especially ceramics and tools, and built structures in any kind of material, buildings, standing alone, or in a village or an urban net. Monuments, tombs, streets, roads, infrastructures such as bridges, pits, granaries. Man-made intervention in nature may have happened quite recently or millennia ago. Remains can be visible in a more or less good condition, or they can stay buried in the ground. In some cases, these remains get totally unnoticed. Aerial photographs can, most of the times, detect the underground presence of man-made remains in the middle of nowhere, as it happens, for instance, in the salty desert flat lowland in the south of Iraq. The archaeologist digs in search of proofs of past human presence in a territory. Among these remains, architectural ones can be one of the most important, and search of evidence might sometimes be especially important. These traces say that human beings stayed there for a period of time long enough to have left marks on or under the ground that can still be detected nowadays. The remains can connect us to human beings from the past and can inform us about their way of living and their behavior. Remains of permanent settlements are the remains that can be especially interesting for architects. The approach of an architect might eventually be enlightening when archaeologists uncover remains of a settlement, a building, a group of built structures, a village or a city, a whole planned territory. The archaeologist is interested in the remains. He or she studies the structures, walls, floors, doors, windows, terraces, sometimes roofs. In Egypt, for instance, decoration, oven, fires, benches, altars, sanitary structures, water and grain deposits. The built structures are studied element by element. The archaeologist is interested in a man-made object, a tangible object. He or she needs something to be grasped. These remains are not easily distinguished from the earth that covers them. In Mesopotamia, for instance, mud brick structures have the same consistence, the same aspect as the surrounding earth. A most careful excavation has to be undertaken. Quite a large number of architectural remains built of mud have been lost at the beginning of the 20th century because the first archaeologists digging in the Middle East used to stone and marble from the Egyptian, Greek and Roman structures were unable to distinguish just by digging earth from man-made structures built of earth. It is still not easy at all, even nowadays, to be able to detect buried mud walls without missing and tearing them down, as it has happened at the beginning of the Near Eastern archaeology. An architect cannot give much light on this problem. The reason is that an architect makes and studies architecture. Architecture, a building, for instance, is not a built item. It does not necessarily have to be built to become architecture, to exist as architecture. Architecture is not a thing like a statue or a ceramic, for instance. It cannot be grasped. It just can be looked at, dreamed and thought. Walls, floors, ceilings are not architecture. They are built things. They may have been built with much care. They can be admirable, a perfect man-made item. It is true that architecture deals with perfection, but not with perfection that is the result of a technical work. The etymology of the word architecture comes from the Greek word tekne, but it does not imply the architecture is a technical achievement. Tekne means creation. Architecture is a creation of the mind. Architecture is thought space, a place that is a result of thinking of a space. Architecture is a living space. Architecture transforms a space in a place where human beings can live. They will live the life that they have chosen or the life that they have been given to. But independently of which sort of life is developed in an architectural frame, architecture is the condition for life, human life, to be rooted in a place. Architecture relates human beings to a place. Architecture embodies dreams, hopes and fears. It encapsulates memories and visions. It creates a scenario where human beings can dream. They can dream that they are going to be able to live there in the built or envisioned space. Archaeology deals with objects, while architecture deals with sensations. Their way of looking at the world is different. An archaeologist thinks how a building has been built, an architect why it has been built. He or she thinks which vision is embodied in a built space. The reasons he or she is looking for are not just functional reasons, but spiritual ones. Someone one day has decided that this place was the right place to live, rest and die. And all efforts were made to transform a non-qualified space in a place which would be suitable for a certain vision of life. Suitable to enclose a vision and keep it alive. We live in dreams, which means that we need architecture, as dreams have to be tied to a place. In that sense, the architect deals so with what is between walls, spaces, built spaces. Spaces which are connected thanks to opening in walls, windows and doors. Spaces that are closed and open, spaces that belong to public and private places. And all these spaces have been made by human beings because they have been first dreamed of or thought. Architecture shows that a human being has thought about a space. He or she has thought how to transform a space that satisfies his or her physical and spiritual needs. Architecture does not need to be perfect. It needs to be able to offer protection, to offer a place where to live and rest. A place for human beings being able to stay to take care of the space. An architect looks at remains as spaces where life has taken place. The built space was built by human beings, whether architects, builders, technicians, and inhabitants with no specific knowledge. As architecture, it does not need technical skill to be architecture, but it needs a mind that is able to have a vision of how life will take place. Architecture can be established by anyone who wants to live in a place because he or she feels that this place is his or her place to live. He or she feels that his or her life would be better, would take place in that space. He or she feels that he or she would be a true human being in this dreamed or thought space. So anyone who wants a whole life can be an architect. Anyone who is able to envision a way of life and to project it in a space, whether he or she has the right and needed knowledge to build. This is knowledge that can be learned, but we cannot learn how to live. This is something that comes from our inner self. The built space that the architect studies is a lived space, a place where people once lived. Then an architect has to imagine how inhabitants were living in such a space. An architect has to think about the sort of life and the quality of life among the structures unearthed by the archaeologist. An archaeologist asks about what type of structure is what is being excavated. An architect asks for the reason of this found building, why it had been built and for whom. But we have to be aware that both questions by architects and archaeologists are necessary. Both ways of looking to the ruins are complementary. No one has a whole vision of the structures and their function or meaning. We remember the first time we were involved in an archaeological mission. Dr. Maria Grazia Masaikh, leader of the archaeological mission at Tel Masaikh, offered to us the possibility of being involved in our first archaeological mission due to our studies on Mesopotamian mythology or of architecture. She was thinking that we, as architects, could bring a different point of view of the archaeological remains of a Neo-Assyrian palace. This huge dwelling had been planned and built following a known typology already used in Neo-Assyrian imperial palaces, in spite of the fact that the Tel Masaikh one was a provincial structure built by or for a local governor. What Dr. Masaikh was expecting from us was an opinion on which sort of life the palace used to offer. It is important to decide about the function of a building. A sanctuary does not necessarily function as a palace. The reason for the structure, the way the building was planned and built, depends on different religious and profane reasons, from economy to ecology. Knowledge about the vision of the world and from customs from the ancient people who built the structure is needed, if this is possible to get. Ancient reasons justifying the plan of the building do not necessarily match ours. They can even be judged absurd or incomprehensible nowadays. But we have to try as much as possible to judge the relation of the human beings to the space through their eyes, even if we are aware that, in fact, we cannot avoid our conceptions, the way we frame and judge the space. The fact that ancient people did not need to think about their culture because they were part of it, because they created it, while we have to learn it and we have to try to forget about ours, is a most significant difference that cannot be ignored. We're looking at ancient times through our eyes, our expectations, our criteria and our knowledge. We're not, and we shall never be, them or like them. So our opinion on the way the built space was used is necessarily conditioned by the fact that we, as spectators, belong to the 21st century. At the same time, we're used to a certain level of comfort and to use the space in a certain way. Considerations about how the space was perceived and about the quality of the space have to take into account that our opinions are based on different criteria from ancient ones. For instance, if we look at pre-Columbian ruins, Maya dwellings seemed excessively small and somber. We would have difficulties living inside them. We would judge them unacceptable. But the remaining dwellings are mostly places, homes for the elite. Our opinion, in this case, has no value at all. We can only say that my elite people were living quite differently from us. Their standards of living would not be accepted in a contemporary Western at least, society. But this does not mean that spaces that we judge comfortable or not were necessarily perceived in another way. A built space was structured in such a way not because their feeling of homeliness was necessarily different from ours, but because homeliness was not important or was not so important as it is nowadays. If this is true, we can judge ancient built spaces and consider them as they were considered. The difference lays in the fact that our judgment, which could be important for us and for the way we react in front of a certain space, was not important at all for ancient people. Space might be perceived as an uncomfortable, a dreary space, but this space was accepted and used because other values were more appreciated, such as security, for instance, or closeness. As an example, for me, living in a closed resort would be most strange. I am sure it is strange too for the people who live in such imprisoned spaces. But they consider that their security, the security of relatives and goods, is the most important thing, and so they tolerate a certain sensation of being controlled all the time. Which are the categories or qualities that transform the space and give it a certain aspect? Proportions, for sure, are important. Are certain proportions preferred to others? We are not sure. We do not know whether there are certain invariants, as it has been said sometimes. Proportions are conditioned by the beings which are going to live in a certain space. They can be human, but also non-human beings. In that case, our opinion has to take into account the function of the building. But this is not always known. For instance, we were not sure whether certain rooms in the Neo-Assyrian palace at Tel Masaikh had a profane or a sacred function. And even if they were for a profane function, the king or the governor might have had a special human nature, so his or her living space could not be like the one for entirely human beings. Light and ventilation are essential, like proportions, to qualify a closed space, at least in our Western societies. Lightness might not have been as important as it is today, but can human beings nowadays and in old days really live in a dark room? In such climates as the desert climate in the Syria-Iraqi dry area where Tel Masaikh is located, can we live today and in the past in a badly ventilated room, even if our perception, our needs or comfort might not be the same? After all, Neo-Assyrian lived a similar life to most people until the First World War, even until the Second World War, in certain Mediterranean areas such as central Spain. So we can imagine how the space was perceived and felt in spite of cultural and religious differences. We were confronted with a problem when we were evaluating the quality of life, which means the quality of space in which life was embodied, in the Neo-Assyrian palace of Tel Masaikh. In the dense web of rooms, no one was looking to the exterior, but certain rooms, such as the audience hall, was facing the main large courtyard, while others were just connected to other rooms, with no door or windows to the outside space. No light nor air was able to enter these spaces. Located in a central area of the palace, they were looking more like storerooms, which they were not. There was only one solution to the problem, a solution that an architect can find more easily than an archaeologist. Archaeologists draw. They draw plans and volumes. Walls are an essential part of the excavations. They see walls, but archaeologists sometimes do not really feel that these walls limited or enclosed a volume. Archaeologists are not totally aware of the third dimension. Their gaze is directed to the ground. They think in volumes, but they see plans. The third dimension, the vertical dimension, is a sort of foreign notion which is not totally assumed. Volumes have not necessarily the same height. Le Corbusier, the Swiss modern architect, defined one's architecture as a splendid play of volumes under the sun. The play of volumes could offer an explanation to rooms with no ventilation in the Neo-Assyrian palace of Tel Masaikh. These rooms could have been higher than the surrounding ones. Windows or openings could have been located just below the roof. In that case, light and air might have entered through these upper windows. But the effect caused by light coming from above is different to the effect caused by light entering a window placed at the height of a human eye. We do not know whether a transcendental quality was given to this light, but is it just by chance that the illuminated rooms from above were rooms with frescoes, rooms that might have been sacred spaces? But how can we be sure that a room was higher than another? After all, people could have accepted or assumed darkness. Again, architecture or building techniques could be useful. The weight of the walls was higher in a tall room than in a normal or lower room. So, the walls had to be wider. If not, the roof might have fallen. A technical vision was requested, and an architect might bring this point of view. In concluding, we could say that an archaeological mission could function perfectly without any architect. But if architects are asked to participate, they can look at the archaeological remains in a different way, looking or thinking differently from archaeologists. We have already said that architecture is a lived space, or it is the whole sum of conditions that transform a space into a place emptied of human life into a locus conceived for human beings to live in one place. So, architecture deals with an inhabited place. It deals with its inhabitants. This is why an architect does not have to excavate, but he has to dream and think. He has to feel how this space was used as a human place. He thinks not in walls, in physical remains, which are most necessary to think about human life in a place, but in the sort of life that was made possible, that was symbolized too, by built shapes. Architecture deals with the spiritual function of a place. It is the archaeologist who has to decide whether this consideration or thought is needed or important, whether the remains of a built space have to be seen as objects or as the embodied memory of past human beings. And B. This paper is dedicated to all the Syrian colleagues, archaeologists, students or people working at the house of the mission at Tel Masaikh, thanks to whom we have had a wonderful time in Syria, people who have lost all houses, relatives or even their life.